At the Culver City Martial Arts Championship in March 1985, a Saturday afternoon, 2,000 seats were filled to the back wall of an unremarkable gymnasium off a boulevard lined with storage facilities and independent studios. The sun was still high outside the tall windows, casting flat geometric light across the polished floor. Nobody was there expecting history. They were there to watch a tournament. They were there to see who could throw the farthest, who could strike with the most precision, who could move through the forms without a whisper of wasted motion. Steven Seagal stood in the center of the floor that afternoon, and he was exactly what a tournament director dreams of. 32 years old, 6 feet 4 inches tall, 245 pounds arranged in a frame of studied muscle. His Aikido lineage traced directly to Japan. He had studied under masters. He had opened a dojo that was spoken about in certain circles. His technique had substance. His resume had weight. He was, by every measure that matters to an audience of martial artists, unquestionably dangerous. For 2 years running, he had not lost a match. The journalists at the event had noted his movement, the efficiency, the control, the way he could flow from one form into another, without the hesitation that betrays a man thinking his way through his own body. He was also certain, the kind of certainty that comes from a decade of validation, from students who bowed, from mirrors that showed back what he wanted to see, from a world that had told him for so long that he was the superior thing that the message had stopped being words and had become bone. In the next 47 seconds, with 4 movements, that certainty would become something else entirely. Nobody in that gymnasium, not the tournament director with his clipboard balanced on one knee, not the judges in their folding chairs arranged in 3 rows, not the journalist from the regional martial arts quarterly who had driven 90 minutes to cover the event. Nobody understood that they were about to witness the difference between excellence and mastery. They did not understand that 2 men, when placed at the correct distance from one another, are not equal by any measure of technique or credential or reputation. The story that Steven Seagal had told himself for 32 years, the story about what he could do at speed when his will was unchecked, was about to collide with a truth he had never been forced to see. The sentence he would hear only the challenger could speak, in a voice so quiet that only he would remember it, would haunt some part of his reasoning for the next 4 decades. Stay till the end if you want to find out what that sentence was. It began that morning, before the tournament opened, in the preparations that Steven Seagal conducted alone in a back studio. He had trained with intensity. His forms were precise. He had conducted himself as a champion conducts himself, with the discipline of ritual, with the certainty that comes from knowing you are the best thing in your domain. He had given interviews. He had spoken to students. He had positioned himself at the center of the narrative the way a man does when the narrative has never contradicted him. Around him, in the gymnasium itself, a smaller world was assembling. The judges were old enough to have seen trends in martial arts come and go like weather patterns. One of them, a Shotokan master who had trained since 1958, carried in his back the fractures of men who had learned to respect distance before they learned to respect form. Another judge was a weapons instructor who had spent 17 years teaching practical defense to law enforcement. They did not speak to one another about what they were about to watch. They simply took their chairs and waited for the matches to begin. There was a journalist named Harold Stein present that day, a man who had covered martial arts tournaments since 1971. He had seen the rise and fall of many champions. He had seen arrogance collapse into humility more than once. He had learned to watch not just for technique but for the subtle tells that separate a man who is aware of his limitations from a man who has never had to confront them. He was there ostensibly to cover Seagal's expected championship. What he would actually witness would become the story he spent the rest of his career retelling in dojos from Long Beach to Phoenix. Steven Seagal moved through the tournament with the quality of wind moving through structures, clean, undamaged, winning each match by margins that were not close. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon he had advanced to the final match. The crowd had begun to see what the judges could see, that this man was not operating at the same level as his competitors. He was faster. He was smarter about distance. He was a step ahead of every technique they threw at him. At 3:07 in the afternoon, the announcer called the final match. Two names were read. One belonged to Steven Seagal, the other belonged to a man who had driven from San Luis Obispo, a man who had come simply to compete. The crowd moved to attention. The light from the windows had shifted. It was now the kind of light that falls on gymnasium floors as afternoon turns, and it caught the dust in the air and made the space look larger than it was. There was a delay at the entrance to the floor. The crowd noticed it. The judges noticed it. Something in the gymnasium's ordinary attention shifted. Someone was not yet present who needed to be present. Chuck Norris walked onto that gymnasium floor at 3:11, and he did not walk as a man who had been training all morning in the back rooms. He did not walk as a man who was participating in the tournament. He walked as a man who had arrived at that gymnasium 4 minutes before, who had been sitting in the third row of seats in street clothes, a white t-shirt with the left collar slightly tilted, a denim jacket from the 1970s that had seen decades of sun enfolding, a cap pulled so low that his eyes were barely visible. He was smaller than Steven Seagal by 6 inches and perhaps 30 pounds. He was older by 4 years. He was unknown to everyone in that room except Harold Stein, who had turned in his seat so fast his notebook had fallen open to the floor. The recognition did not spread all at once. It spread the way a current moves across water, row by row, starting at the judges' table and moving backward through the seated mass of martial artists. Someone would touch the shoulder of the person in front of them. Someone would whisper a name. The name would move from mouth to mouth. By the time Chuck Norris had taken his position across from Steven Seagal, nearly everyone in the gymnasium understood what was occurring. The tournament had become something else. The formal match had become a reckoning. Steven Seagal's face did not change. This is the thing that people who heard the story afterward would argue about for years. His face did not change, and therefore he either did not understand what was happening, or he understood it perfectly and it did not matter to him. Those are the two interpretations that would live in oral history, and both tell you something different about the man who walked out onto that gymnasium floor that afternoon. Chuck Norris did not acknowledge the crowd. He did not wave. He did not smile. He simply stood. The garment folding ritual began at 3:12. Chuck Norris removed his denim jacket. He did not throw it aside. He folded it once, then again, creating a rectangle the size of a small book. He set it down on the floor at the edge of the mat, perhaps 4 feet from where he would stand. The action was deliberate. The gymnasium had gone quiet. The sound of the jacket being folded, the small sound of cloth against cloth, seemed to move through the space like a note that had been struck. He removed his cap. He folded that as well, with the same intention, and placed it beside the jacket. He was now barefoot, in the white t-shirt and simple trousers. He was smaller than his opponent by 6 inches and 30 pounds. He did not look up. The signature line would be spoken by one of the judges, not by Chuck Norris himself, and this would be important to how the story survived in oral history. The Shotokan master, the one who had trained since 1958, would turn to Harold Stein and he would say, so quietly that only Stein heard it, he has already lost. He just does not know it yet. He was speaking about Steven Seagal. He was speaking with an absolute certainty that carried no doubt. He was speaking the way a man speaks when he has seen this particular arrangement of elements before. And he knows how it ends. The match began at 3:13. Steven Seagal moved forward with the speed that had defined his entire career. He moved with technique. He moved with control. He moved the way a man moves who has trained thousands of times, who knows exactly how to execute his art. His first technique was a circular attack, a movement that had worked for him consistently throughout the tournament. He threw it with full commitment. He threw it with precision. Second one. The movement existed in the air for perhaps 3/10 of a second. In that space, distance was negotiated. Chuck Norris did not block it. He did not parry it. He simply was not there. The technique moved through empty space. The speed of it created a sound, a small disturbance in the air. The judges heard it. Harold Stein heard it. The Shotokan master saw the micron-thin space between the striking hand and Chuck Norris's shoulder. and he understood. In that instant, that what was happening was not the collision of two skilled men. What was happening was the encounter between a man and the specific answer to his particular technique. Steven Seagal recovered. His body was competent. His form was solid. He adjusted his stance and prepared for the second approach. The tournament director, a man named Marcus Webb who had supervised championship matches for 15 years, sat with both hands flat on the folding table in front of him. He did not reach for his clipboard. He did not look away. He was witnessing the precise moment when the official narrative of his tournament was being overwritten by something that had not been scheduled, had not been invited, and could not be stopped. Second 2. Steven Seagal executed a technique that was more advanced than the first, requiring better timing and more sophisticated footwork. It was a technique that would have worked against anyone else in that gymnasium. He had used it 42 times in matches over the preceding years, and it had succeeded 41 times. It was his second most reliable attack. He committed to it with the full measure of his skill and his certainty. Chuck Norris was already moving before the technique began, not in response to it but in parallel to it, as if he was executing his own sequence, and Steven Seagal's attack had simply been poor timing. The technique reached the space where Chuck Norris's body should have been. The space was empty. The force of the movement took Steven Seagal past his opponent, requiring him to pivot and reset. Harold Stein leaned forward in his seat. His notebook remained on his lap. He was no longer taking notes, he was simply watching. He was memorizing. He understood that he had come to the gymnasium to cover a tournament, and would leave it with a different story entirely. Here is the principle that exists in physical confrontation between truly skilled men. A fight is not two men hitting each other. A fight is a negotiation about distance. It is a conversation about where you can safely exist and where you cannot. It is the discovery at speed of what one man knows about the other man's body that the other man does not know about his own. Steven Seagal had spent 32 years in martial arts, and he was a legitimate master of his art. What he did not know was how it felt when another man understood his body better than he did. Second 3. Steven Seagal executed a third technique, and this one was his most advanced. The technique that required the most timing and the most distance calculation. He had not used it in competition very often because it was unnecessary. It was the technique he would deploy only when facing an opponent of his level. He was deploying it now. Chuck Norris moved, and the motion was so economical, so without wasted space, that Steven Seagal's technique not only missed but overextended him. For the first time in the match, Chuck Norris stepped forward. Not to strike, not to finish, simply to close distance by 3 inches. The light from the gymnasium windows was still falling on the floor, indifferent to what was occurring above it. The coffee cup sat on the bench in the 3rd row, on the lap of a stunt coordinator named Mitchell Cross who had driven from Los Angeles to watch the tournament. The cup had been full at 3 o'clock. The cup was still full now, untouched. His other hand was open, palm down on the bench beside him. His thumb was the only part of him that was moving, pressing repeatedly into the wood. This was how his body was expressing the understanding that the event he was watching was not an accident. It was not a mistake in the scheduling. It was the specific arrangement of 2 men who had chosen to occupy the same space, and one of them had arranged it that way. The boom operator stood in the corner of the gymnasium with the equipment that was not recording this match because this was a tournament, not a film set, and there was no need to capture this particular encounter. His hands had gone still at 3:13. At the moment Steven Seagal's first technique moved through empty air. He had not moved since. He was not a martial artist. He was not trained in watching foretells. But something in the sequence of events had communicated itself to him at a level that did not require expertise. He understood that he was watching the moment when one man's entire narrative was being rewritten by another man's absolute control. If you want to understand what it means to be truly skilled, witness it at the moment when it is being denied entry to the space where it has always worked before. Second 4. Steven Seagal was now operating in a territory that was unfamiliar to him. His 3 best techniques had failed in succession. His body was competent enough to recover from each one, but the recovery was becoming more demanding. He could feel that his opponent was not defending himself by a margin. He could feel that his opponent was moving with a precision that suggested perfect knowledge of what was coming. He executed a 4th technique, a synthesis of multiple movements, something that required the kind of integration that only comes from years of practice. Chuck Norris slipped it the way a man slips a rope that someone is holding slack, by simply not being in the place where the rope was moving. The movement created a gap in Steven Seagal's defense, a brief opening in the moment between techniques. In that opening, Chuck Norris could have struck. He could have finished the match in that instant. He did not. He simply stepped back, and his hands remained at his sides. The JavaScript of what was occurring was now visible to everyone in the gymnasium. Steven Seagal was not losing a match. He was being deconstructed. He was being shown, in real time, in front of 2,000 witnesses, what it looked like when a man's entire understanding of his own ability was insufficient. The story Steven Seagal had told about himself for 32 years, the story of mastery, of superiority, of unchallenged skill, was being rewritten at a pace of 3 feet per second. This is when the mercy moment begins. This is when the truth that has been hidden becomes the thing that is offered as a choice. Chuck Norris moved forward, not with violence, not with the speed that he had been using to avoid Steven Seagal's techniques, but with deliberation, with something that resembled ceremony. He moved into a position where a finishing strike would be possible. His hand rose, his arm extended. His form was perfect. Every witness in the gymnasium knew what was about to happen. Steven Seagal knew what was about to happen. The strike stopped 1 inch from Steven Seagal's temple. It was not a strike that had been pulled back at the last instant. It was not a technique that had lost its commitment. It was a strike that had been executed with perfect precision to a specific distance, and then held there, in the space between violence and mercy, for the duration of exactly 1 breath. Harold Stein's notebook finally opened, but his hands did not move to write. He simply sat with the book open in his lap, and his eyes moved from Chuck Norris's hand, hovering 1 inch from Steven Seagal's head, to Chuck Norris's face. The face was not expressing rage. It was not expressing contempt. It was expressing something more complete than either of those things. It was expressing understanding. Chuck Norris's hand lowered. He stepped back. He extended his hand towards Steven Seagal, in the gesture that traditionally means let us rise together, the gesture that offers the fallen the dignity of their own completion. Steven Seagal looked at the extended hand. He looked at Chuck Norris's face. He looked at the gymnasium around him, at the 2,000 people who had not moved, who were not making sound, who were simply bearing witness to the choice that he was now required to make. Chuck Norris spoke then, and his voice was quiet enough that only Steven Seagal could hear it. The specific content of that sentence would be argued about for 40 years. Some people who heard the story retell it would say that he said, "Now you know." Others would claim he said, "It does not matter what you have told yourself." Harold Stein, who would spend the next 4 decades telling this story to anyone who would listen, always insisted that what he heard was, "The speed you think you have is the speed you show yourself in mirrors." The truth was that nobody outside of Steven Seagal and Chuck Norris ever knew exactly what was said in that moment. The privacy of that sentence became the protection that allowed Steven Seagal to walk away from the gymnasium, not as a defeated man, but as a man who had been offered knowledge. Steven Seagal stood. He did not move toward the extended hand. He remained motionless for 6 seconds. The gymnasium held its attention. Everyone understood that a choice was being made. Everyone understood that the choice belonged only to Steven Seagal. He could accept the hand and the implicit apology for believing in his own narrative too completely, or he could stand alone in his defeat and construct an explanation that protected some portion of his certainty. He walked toward Chuck Norris. He did not take the offered hand. He simply walked past him toward the edge of the gymnasium floor where his garments were waiting. As he moved, the tournament director with both hands flat on the table stood up from his seat. The Shotokan master who had trained since 1958 stood up. Harold Stein stood up. The stunt coordinator named Mitchell Cross, who still had his coffee untouched in his lap, stood up. They did not applaud. That is not how respect moves in certain spaces. They simply stood, in a silent acknowledgement that something true had occurred. Chuck Norris walked back to where his jacket and cap were waiting. He picked them up. He did not unfold them. He simply held them, as a man might hold them if he had walked out of a gymnasium after conducting a transaction that had nothing to do with winning or losing. Witnesses began to move before he reached the entrance. By the time Chuck Norris had removed his shoes and stepped back into the hallway of the gymnasium complex, the story of what had occurred had begun its migration. A stunt coordinator spoke to a teacher. The teacher spoke to a student. The student spoke to someone at a different dojo. The tournament director's notation in his official records simply read, "Special match. Championship held in abeyance. Participants both withdrew." But the story traveled differently than the official record. It traveled as witness accounts do, through the telephone game of oral history, acquiring details and shedding others. Some versions claimed that the match had lasted 2 seconds. Some claimed it had lasted 45. Some versions said that Seagal had thrown 5 techniques and all 5 had failed. Some versions said that Chuck Norris had spoken to him in Japanese. Some versions became so distant from the original truth that they were almost unrecognizable. What remained constant across all versions was the core understanding. One man had arrived at a gymnasium expecting to remain unchallenged, and had encountered another man for whom challenge was not a category that applied. The story moved through dojos and training halls. It moved through the years, acquiring the patina of historical truth. By 1992 it had become a legend. By 2001, it had become the thing that people referenced when they talked about the difference between a man's reputation and a man's reality. Steven Seagal returned to his own dojo that evening. He did not teach class. He closed the studio and spent the night alone. He did not speak publicly about the encounter for nearly 3 years. When he finally addressed it, in an interview for a regional martial arts magazine, he was careful with his words. He said that the match had been unexpected but educational. He said that encountering men of different styles could be broadening. He said that not every encounter has a winner and a loser. He did not say that he had seen the limits of his own ability. He did not say that he had been offered a choice and had chosen not to take the hand that was extended. He said the things a man says when he has been presented with a truth about himself and has chosen not to fully embrace it. This is the fork in the road that every man is given when his certainty is proven insufficient. Steven Seagal chose to reframe rather than to reckon. Both choices are usable by a man who wishes to keep living. One of them allows for growth. One of them allows for continuation. The story does not judge between them. It simply records that the choice was made. Harold Stein would tell this story for 40 years, refining it, emphasizing different elements depending on his audience. When he was speaking to young martial artists, he would emphasize the lesson in distance control. When he was speaking to older men, he would emphasize the mercy moment. When he was speaking to journalists, he would emphasize the way that reputation and reality diverge. But across all those retellings, the core elements remained the same. A man arrived at a gymnasium in Culver City on a Saturday afternoon in March, and left it changed by an encounter with something larger than his own narrative. The gymnasium itself was demolished in 1998 to make room for office space. The specific floor where the match occurred no longer exists. The judges have mostly passed away. Mitchell Cross, the stunt coordinator with the untouched coffee cup, died in 2009. Harold Stein passed in 2019, and his notebooks, containing 40 years of martial arts journalism and multiple accounts of that afternoon in Culver City, were left to a martial arts archive in Southern California. Chuck Norris never spoke publicly about the match. He was asked about it many times, by journalists and interviewers and fans who wanted to know what had actually occurred. He never provided details. When pressed, he would simply say that he had met Steven Seagal on the mat, and that they had parted in understanding. When asked if he had won, he would say that the match had been about something other than winning. When asked about the private sentence that had been spoken so quietly that no one but Seagal had heard it, he would smile in a way that suggested the sentence was not his to speak. He took it with him through the rest of his life, and it was not shared. The truth that exists at the center of this story is this. The speed you think you have is the story you tell yourself in solitude. The speed you actually possess is the speed that exists when another person is in the room, moving with perfect knowledge of what you are about to do. The gap between those two speeds is where wisdom lives. It is a small gap. It is also an impassable gap until the moment it is not. Steven Seagal never publicly challenged another man at that level again. He continued his career. He made films. He taught Aikido. He wrote books. He became over time a figure of different kind of legendary status. But something in his certitude, something in the way he moved through the world, had been altered by that afternoon in Culver City. It was subtle. It was not visible in the photographs that were taken of him. But anyone who trained with him in the years that followed said that something had changed. There was a reserve there now. There was a question mark that had not been there before. A man's entire understanding of what he is capable of can be rewritten in 47 seconds, if he encounters someone who understands him better than he understands himself. Next week we will talk about how Chuck Norris encountered a welterweight boxer from Detroit who claimed on live television that a martial artist could not survive 2 rounds with a trained pugilist. What occurred between them will tell you something about the difference between a sport and an art. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss it. And in the comments below, tell us where you are watching from, and whether you have ever had the experience of meeting your own limitations face to face.